Welcome to One Mind Zen. Tonight's Dharma talk is given by Robert Koho Epstein.
I'm a big fan of the word mu, not only because it has led to thousands, literally thousands of Zen-related cow jokes over the decades in the Western world, but even more than that, mainly because of its corresponding word and concept in Chinese, which is wu. And the word woo has a nice feeling in English as well, like woo, you know? So I thought I would talk a little bit today about some Chinese concepts that relate both to Zen practice and to Taoist practice and how they sort of interrelate and overlap and speak to each other. They're all based in the wonderful word of wu. So to some extent, these ideas are kind of unique to the Zen and Taoist forms of no self, you could say. Now, Taoism doesn't speak explicitly of no self or not self the way Buddhism does. But the way in which Taoist practice takes place and the attendant concepts that stem from that practice really demonstrate the development of another way of working with no self to a great degree. The Taoist way is to abnegate the sense of personal self in a rather active way. Taoist practitioners tend to melt into the background and take actions without announcing ownership of what they do. You could say a very advanced Taoist practitioner might reach the height of their practice by seeming to disappear. In fact, Lao Tzu himself, the founder of Taoism, did in fact disappear. And no one, even today, knows the circumstances of his death or where his final destination was. He just took off. And for someone who's extremely famous, that's not so easy. It's said that his seminal work, the Tao Te Ching, was written, which it translates to something like, according to Arthur Welly, it's the way and its power. And that the Tao Te Ching was written under duress as he passed the checkpoint out of his region of China. The gatekeeper, recognizing him, said he wouldn't let him pass unless he wrote down something of his wisdom to leave behind for others. And perhaps that's why Lao Tzu included in his writing the famous saying, "Those who know do not speak, those who speak do not know," maybe chiding the gatekeeper a little bit for making him write everything down. And echoing the Buddhist lay master Vimalakirti, who practiced a similar teaching without announcing it. And nobody ever forced him to write a book, although they wrote about him in the sutras. Gave him a whole sutra of his own, in fact, now that I think of it. So now let us start a kind of first round or cursory review, because these are very deep topics, of some of these key concepts that live on the intersection between Taoist and Zen philosophy, and which they may largely share. And we'll get a little bit more into the Zen aspect of it as we go along as well. First off is Wu Xin in Chinese, or Mu Xin Japanese. As we know from the Wu or Mu koan of Joshu, it was originally Wu in Chinese and turned into Mu in Japanese, is a very important word in Chinese philosophy and in the history of Zen. Asked if a dog had Buddha nature, Joshu said Wu. He really said Wu. We say Mu. Wu in Chinese may be a term of negation, meaning no or not, but it also may be a word that indicates nothing or nothingness or emptiness. And the Chinese language has a funny way of doing that. It has multiple meanings depending on the context. So in that koan, Joshu was hinting at the nature of Buddha nature as emptiness or shunyata or voidness. So if our true nature is a type of voidness, then how would we experience and express that voidness? Acting out of shunyata, how would we behave? We'll take a further look at that a little bit later. The second word in Wuxin is Shin, and that is usually translated as mind in Zen writing. So Mu, no, Shin, mind, no mind. So in that sense, Wuxin would mean empty mind. It's often translated as no mind, but I kind of like empty mind, or a mind coming from Wu, or emptiness or voidness. What is the emptiness or voidness that such a mind might be coming from? Well, in Zen, the idea is that if one's mind is truly empty, that means that they are focused on the aware perception of the true nature of the moment, rather than being caught up in thoughts and concepts. In such a moment, with full attention on the elements of the situation, the Zen adept is able to act spontaneously and take the appropriate action without intervening thought, worries, or doubts. That sounds nice. In other words, without dukkha. This sometimes leads to pretty extreme-looking action, or action that's hard to follow, but sometimes it leads to more subtle action, or action that is effective but hardly discernible. I'm thinking vaguely about one koan where Zen master Tokusan, in his older age, came down with his bowl to get his meal, and the cook saw him and chided him and said, we haven't rung the dinner bell yet. What are you doing here? And Zen master Tokusan just bowed, turned around, and went back to his room. So that's a kind of subtle response, not a very big response. He didn't break the bowl or hit the cook, but he just turned around and went back. But that is an adaptation, which you could say perhaps comes from Mushin, just according with the situation and responding to it. And in the case of Joshu's instruction to the student who had entered the monastery, how should I practice Zen? He said, well, if you've eaten your rice porridge, wash your bowl. So that's the subtle response of Mushin. But how does one develop Mushin or Wushin? Through meditative practice, of course, and also the practice of applied meditation, sometimes denoted as mindfulness or awareness in everyday life. If we lead with our perception and look before we leap into conceptualization, we may be better able to see what is, rather than what we think is there, and leap into action with more clarity. Another interesting side note of the definition of Mushin is that Shin, like in the usual Chinese linguistic way, has multiple meanings. Shin is not only a word that means mind or consciousness, but it also can be used to mean the spiritual essence of a person or the divine power of nature. And these things are all kind of floating around each other in the word, in the language. So the way in which a language is used and understood in a culture is kind of important. So rather than merely translating this Chinese expression, very Westernly, literally as no mind, although that works okay, meaning no thought or mental process. Another word that Shin can mean, we may look at it as the spirit of Shunyata. If you look at Shin as spirit or one's true essence, you could say that you are acting out of the true essence of emptiness, your true essence as emptiness, when you are acting spontaneously without an intervening thought process. The spirit of Shunyata, the spirit of emptiness or the void, which is the basis of the true nature of all things. When we act in the spirit of emptiness, we don't act from personal thoughts, but from something more basic and intuitive and connected to nature and the world, which is why it can also mean the spirit of nature, and that's kind of melded together in the definition. To summarize Mushin, Google AI, my favorite reference, very nicely says the following. They're really very good. They're better than Chat GPT. They do a lot of research and come up with very good summaries. Mushin describes a state of mind where one is free from conscious thought, fear, anger, or ego, allowing for spontaneous and effortless action. I challenge any Zen master to come up with a better definition than that. That's pretty good. And they add, according to Shotokan Karate Online, a website that could, call for greater study. This state allows a practitioner's movements to flow naturally and effectively as if guided by instinct, or maybe even actually guided by instinct. That might even be possible. So next on our list is no self, the natural correlate of no mind or Wushin. No self, originally called anatta in basic Buddhist philosophy, refers to the realization that none of the elements of experience, from physical objects to thoughts and feelings, are actually part of oneself or controlled by oneself, and so are not proper objects of clinging. So this is the Buddha's argument not to cling to anything because it's not really pertaining to you. It's just stuff that's happening and changing, and you can't really do anything about it anyway. So it's better not to cling to it. I mean, it's a pretty pragmatic message if you think about it. This basic sanity, to use Trungpa Rinpoche's expression, I've always liked that, basic sanity, comes from the very sensible idea that if something is not under one's control, one should not cling to it, because it certainly is going to change or go away in time, sometimes almost immediately, but always eventually. In Buddha's interesting determination, if something cannot be owned or controlled, it cannot properly be called part of oneself. And so all things in life, including one's own body and thoughts, are no self or not self, and should be related to very lightly, rather than tightly clinging to the elements of our lives. So it's not to say that we should, as some monks did in the past, and some may still do today, just get rid of everything. Don't have any objects. Don't own anything. Don't do anything. Just detach from everything and give everything up. It's more like, because that can be a kind of clinging as well, clinging to aversion. So it's more like, just don't grasp onto things so tightly that it hurts when they get taken away. Just the right amount of contact so that you can have a nice relationship with things, but that when they inevitably change or leave, you're not devastated. I mean, that is another way in which Buddha said we can alleviate dukkha, or dissatisfaction and suffering. Just don't cling quite so tightly. And that's another fruit of practice, that if we practice well over time, we can learn to understand the nature of change and lighten our grip on things. As Huangbo put it in more definitive terms, he said, "I will let go with both hands." So that was his, real definitive statement of non-clinging. It's like, okay, I'll let go with one hand, but with the other hand, I'm still holding on. So we should, and so all things in life should be related to very lightly rather than tightly clinging. In a way, this is the real leaving home, pravajra, when one renounces worldly life and becomes a monastic practitioner. We only truly leave home when we stop clinging to objects of experience and instead learn to relate to them more freely according to circumstances. Clinging and craving are the major causes of suffering. And so when we let go and relate to things as they are, we are in a much happier state. If you take it down to that, it's a pretty simple message. Let go and be happy. In Chinese, no self is referred to as wu wo. So get the wu back in there. we can see once again the magic word Wu show up in this formulation. In this case, Wu does seem to mean no or not in relation to Wo or the self. But once again, if we want to put the old Chinese twist on Wu as emptiness or voidness, we can say that Wu Wo is a Wo, a self of Wu, emptiness. So rather than a self of clinging, we have a sense of openness, emptiness, letting go, being present, and not grabbing onto stuff. And that would then fit into the prescription of the Buddha to keep letting go of all things in life. And I say to keep letting go because we inevitably cling. So the practice of letting go is an ongoing practice, like brushing your teeth. Get up, brush your teeth, let go. Google AI, my friend at Google AI, has another interesting rundown of no self, which gives a little more insight into its nature. Zen seeks to penetrate and see through the ingrained illusion of a solid, separate self, which is considered a primary cause of suffering. This isn't about denying existence or individuality, but recognizing the constructed and impermanent nature of the ego or I thought. Once again, in a way, this is a specific rendition of Mushin or no mind. If the mind is emptied of conditioned thinking, the most important thought to be dispensed with, this is me talking again, got mixed in with the quote. Once again, in a way, this is a specific rendition of Mushin or no mind. If the mind is empty of conditioned thinking, the most important thought to be dispensed with is that pesky I thought that creates the illusion of a coherent self out of the flow of bodily experience, thoughts, and perceptions. Yeah, I see that Google AI tried to steal my half of my paragraph there, but I'm not going to cling. And Google AI adds, Zen highlights how clinging to the idea of a self, even a positive one, creates attachment and fuels a cycle of dissatisfaction and suffering. The practice of no self allows for a release from this grasping, leading to a deeper sense of peace and liberation. I think Google AI is pretty damn smart, don't you? I mean, that's well put and has some subtleties in it. Now that we've gotten to this point with our Zen expressions, let's take a look at the application of the magic word Wu to a couple of interrelated Taoist concepts that overlap with the Zen-y ones. We can shed a little more light on the magic Wu in this way. The first of our two Taoist expressions is Wu Wei. Wu here once again means not, and Wei here means action or doing. So Wu Wei means not doing, and it was very popular for a while in either the 80s or 90s. I get my decades mixed up now, but one of those bad decades where nothing much was happening, Wu Wei, not doing, became very popular, at least as a concept. I don't know if anybody was actually practicing it. So Wu Wei means not doing, and we can see how this accords nicely in a way with no mind and no self. If there is no conceptual thought process being relied on, no mind, and there's no fixed self-concept getting in the way, no self, then there is no one to take action. And action, if taken, will not be done by the self, so to speak, but by no self. Or one might say that action would take place, in a sense, by itself. So not doing doesn't necessarily mean doing nothing or not taking action at all, although sometimes it might. But it does mean that one is not asserting the personal self or setting up a personal boundary or basing action on one's own conditioned presumptions and interpretations when one does take an action. And that last idea of no conditioned presumptions and interpretations influencing your understanding of reality and the actions that you take comes pretty directly from the Diamond Sutra. To me, that's one of its main messages, which is don't rely on, the human tendency to experience, interpret, conceptualize, and turn it into a conditioned response. The action that does take place in Wu Wei or not doing will take place in accord with circumstances and is always aimed towards establishing resolution and true harmony. Sometimes harmony can only be achieved by ruffling feathers or breaking down structures, but the aim will always be harmonious rather than egoic or disruptive for its own sake. Often when one sees a situation from the standpoint of wu wei, not doing, one steps back rather than steps forward, allows the energy of the situation at large to have more space in order to reorder itself and reestablish its own harmony, rather than imposing a false harmony on the situation through force and control. And we see a lot of that going around. So Wu Wei is the opposite of force and control. It's seeing the natural order in a situation and allowing the disordered energies to have the space to reorder themselves, rather than you stepping in and doing the reordering with force and control. And that is why it is a type of not doing or refraining from taking over rather than doing. And this stepping back and letting things take care of themselves, not in a random way, but with caring and awareness, applied as an observer participant with some echoes of quantum theory, effect of the observer implied here. Because sometimes by stepping back and looking at the situation with awareness, but leaving space, you actually help to create the space for something to resolve itself. It's not just like you disappear and you have no influence. Your non-interference becomes an influence, and a positive influence. This leads us to our next step and final, you may be happy to know, Taoist idea, which arises directly from Wu Wei, and that is Wei Wu Wei. Doing through not doing kind of naturally arises from that, or accomplishing results through refraining from interference, to put it another way. There was an interesting example of exactly this approach in a recent court case of all places, and it was noted by the commentators, who were experienced legal scholars, that this often takes place when a good judge has control of a case. The two sides could not agree on the approach to the case, as often happens, and instead of laying down the law, no pun intended, and saying you are right and the other side is wrong, the judge said, I'm almost ready to rule in a certain direction, presently undisclosed, but it would be much better if you two sides could work it out yourself and come to a compromise agreement. And if the case were to go to court, it would involve a much lengthier legal process, both exhausting and expensive and convoluted, going back and forth between the two parties. The two sides did not want to be fully ruled against. And so they negotiated and came up with a compromise approach to the case and saved everyone a lot of extra trouble and turbulence. Not only that, but in coming to a compromise, the hard edge of both sides' original attitude had softened, making the result easier for both sides to accept. This is a great example of a good judge practicing Wei Wu Wei by stepping back and saying, I will resolve this if necessary, but first I'm going to step back and let the elements harmonize with each other. And by doing so, she got the most harmonious result, perhaps one that should or could not have been anticipated, and did so in a way that was controlling a positive outcome by not controlling it. When we exercise this kind of intelligent stepping back in order to let the situation reach a better conclusion, better perhaps than anything we could have thought of, we are practicing Wu Xin, no mind, Wu Wo, no self, Wu Wei, not doing, and Wei Wu Wei, doing through not doing, all at the same time. We put aside our personal thoughts and our personal sense of self. We step back and allow our action to be guided by the spirit of nature. Another one of the definitions of Xin, the nature of what is actually taking place and the energies involving that which need to be resolved to have a truly harmonious result.